Where's the district attorney on this bill right now in your borough?
You're referring to District Attorney Cy Vance?
Yeah.
Mr. Vance opposes this legislation.
And the police department?
I haven't received an official memorandum, but I'm fairly confident they oppose the legislation as well.
Okay. And do you know, as of just this year, as of Monday, how many stabbings or slashings they've had in New York City?
Well, there is an increase in crime related to knives in New York City, but as you will know, Al, the NYPD doesn't keep statistics, or only recently has started keeping statistics as to the nature of violent crimes committed by knives. So there is virtually no sample size to look at to suggest that any of the uptick in knife crimes has anything to do with knives currently defined as gravity knives.
Okay. You have an opportunity to read the Post this morning?
The New York Post?
Yes.
I missed it.
Oh, okay. I'll show you a copy of it later. Would it surprise you to find out that as of Monday, there have been, just in New York City, 1,796 stabbings or slashings? And that's actually up from 1,623 stabbings the year before.
Al, I don't doubt the statistics that you're reading, but you're juxtaposing statistics and suggesting that has anything to do with my legislation. It doesn't. There's no indication from any of the uptick in knife-related violent crimes in New York City that it has anything to do with folding knives that open by force of gravity.
Well, you would have to admit that every day we open the paper now, you see somebody slashed, somebody stabbed, right? Somebody using a knife in a robbery. I mean, I've seen an uptick in people using cutting instruments or knives, right, in assaults and in robberies. I mean, every day you open a paper, you see another story. Or the other day, there were about 3 stories on people being cut with a knife or people being slashed with a knife. I mean, would you disagree with that?
No, there has been an uptick in the statistics showing crime related to knives, but again, in no way does that have anything to do with what is and what is not a gravity knife. That is the essence of this legislation. Currently, we have law since 1958 in this state that defines gravity knife in a certain way, which allows for the stop, frisk, arrest, and conviction of people who are simply possessing a folding knife that opens by force of gravity by a flick test of an officer, whether an NYPD officer or a state trooper in Greene or Albany County. It doesn't matter. The point is the ambiguity of the law is what is being discussed and remedied by this bill, not the crime statistics you cite from whatever source you're citing them from.
Well, the purpose of this, if you flick open a knife quickly and it comes right out, it's no different than a switchblade or a stiletto. The only difference is the mechanisms with the switchblades. You push a button, the knife comes out, okay? A gravity knife, all it is you just flick it like this, and it comes out as quick as a switchblade. So you're not trying to decriminalize switchblades here, correct?
That's correct.
And if you have a buck knife or something like that, if you're in the service, there's actually a safety on the buck knife.
But Al, the comparison you make between switchblades and gravity knives is expressly rejected both by Title 15 of the Federal Code as well as my legislation that's mirrored on Title 15 of the Federal Code. The definitions are set by federal law and have been employed in our airports since 2009. There's no evidence to suggest there's any uptick in knife-related crimes in our airports or any federal facilities. Similarly, that's the legislation that's before the House today.
Well, do you know what?
Let me just finish my point. Then
Okay.
The Assembly bill, this bill, is addressed and essentially duplicates federal language that addresses what is and what is not a switchblade, and also an exception as a gravity knife. There's nothing new here.
Well,
and I would tell you, the district attorney, had there been any evidence of uptick in federal crime related to Title Code 15 since 2009, I assure you that would have probably been in the newspaper you cite to today or the 3-page memorandum Mr. Vance set forth.
All right, let me ask you something. Now, do you know when gravity knives themselves were actually separately added to the statute? So they had the statute with switchblades, and they had the statute with stilettos, okay? But what they did was they added gravity knives, right, purposefully into the language of the statute, which is what you're trying to remove now. Now, do you know when that was done?
I believe it's 1958, but I can get back to you on a specific.
Well, I'll agree with you, 1958. How's that?
I'm glad.
Do you know the reasoning why they put gravity knives into the statute?
Well, I think it goes back to a debate you and I had on this bill 2 years ago, Al. I think in 1958, we can go back in history, but gravity knives, as they were once defined, were used in World War II by 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne paratroopers. They were longer knives, and I think, as you mentioned in debate 2 years ago or 3 years ago on this floor, that they were longer knives, of 5, 6, 7, 8 inches. But those are not the knives people are being arrested for. Those are not the knives people are being sent back to jail on parole violations for. Those are not the knives people are doing jail time for.
Okay. Well, the reasoning, you know the reasoning why they put it in? Did you read the legislation or the sponsor memo or anything from when they put those in there, why they did it?
From 1958?
Yeah.
I have read it. It's not, but I don't know I don't recall from the top of my head, so maybe you could talk about it if you'd like.
Well, I'd like to say I read it. My staff read it. I got to give credit where credit is due. But the reason they did it, it was a response to concern over rampant criminal use of knives or gravity knives. So, I mean, over the last couple of years, this body especially has been taking away firearms against people's rights and everything else. And I just look and see we're taking away from law-abiding citizens the right to protect themselves, but we're giving the opportunity for criminals to openly carry weapons.
No, I don't agree with that assessment, Al. And that's not what my legislation does. My legislation's a definition of what is and what is not a gravity knife. And the current gravity knife definition, as it's progressed from 1958 to the present, smacks of ambiguity from county to county, from DA to DA, from police precinct to police precinct. We have an ambiguous law that is defined in a certain way in different parts of this state. That is the essence of a definition and why we define it specifically, mirrored on the 2009 federal language.
Right, but when you get to a gravity knife, you'd agree that, I mean, in order to prove in court, you'd have to show that the knife opens like that.
No, just the opposite. The simple possession of a quote-unquote gravity knife is a strict liability crime and is subject for conviction.
Well, they have to show that it's a gravity knife.
No, what's come down is a police officer will do a so-called flick test, as you've described it. But can you imagine anything more ambiguous than the ability of that police officer to do or not to do a flick test? The strength of that police officer's wrist in being able to perform or not perform a flick test, that's the determining factor on whether somebody goes to prison or not. That's a law that smacks of ambiguity. Well, that's why we need to redefine it.
Let me ask you a question. How many first offenders do you know that have been arrested with a gravity knife, and that's the only charge, have gone to prison?
In a 6 month sample of 2015 in Manhattan County, where I'm from, and where District Attorney Vance prosecutes people, 254 individuals were prosecuted on so-called gravity knife infractions. Of those 254 people, only 4 of those cases, those individuals were charged with intent to use the knife unlawfully. 254 arrests, 254 prosecutions of one form or another. Only 4 of those were with unlawful intent. 250 of those were simple possessions under the current statute as it's defined of gravity knives.
Well,
those
they
are
were
the facts,
charged.
Al.
They were charged.
They were charged, and there was some prosecution. Its result is not...
Were there plea bargains? on just that charge.
These are people with simple possession of a folding knife, run through the system, have to retain counsel, have a record. Maybe they have a parole violation, maybe not, but going to prison, maybe even jail, based upon the possession.
Out of those 254 people, how many of them were sentenced to jail time for having that first offense? And out of those individuals, how many of them, that was the only charge that they were facing?
Al, I don't have the answer to that question.
Okay. How many people out of the 254, you don't know that.
We would have to unseal certain sealed files. You and I are both attorneys. You know that these are not records easily accessible. We'd have to make a FOIL request. We might have to get a judicial order and have to unseal sealed records to get the answer to your question.
Right. Well, as a police officer, I don't know anyone that ever did jail time unless they're using that knife, okay, for that type of infraction. And even practicing in Suffolk County, I know of no one that I've ever seen that got jail time for carrying that knife. And usually if it's a first offense and the person's carrying a knife, you're going to be looking at you'd have to agree, you'd be looking at an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal on that type of case.
Well, that's the problem with the legislation. In Suffolk County, you'll probably get an ACD and you probably do no time. But in Manhattan County, where I live, obviously since 254 people have been prosecuted, there's a different outcome. There 100 miles between Suffolk County, the East End of Long Island, and the business district in Midtown Manhattan. You have different results on the same theoretical crime. That's the ambiguity in the law.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people that get charged with crimes, you would agree, all right, that all of a sudden it gets dismissed, right? Not everybody, who is charged with a crime faces a penalty.
Yes, Al, that's correct.
Okay.
But, yes.
Right. Thank you, Dan. On the bill?
On the bill, Mr. Graf.
All right. Repealing this section of the law, in my opinion, puts the public and police officers at risk. This chamber has made it their passion to disarm law-abiding citizens. This bill will arm people who manifest criminal tendencies. Today and every day, we open the paper and we see another stabbing that took place, another robbery that took place with a knife. If you look at these numbers that they're talking about, in 2015, in half a year, up until June, there was 1,623 stabbings. It's gone up. This year, we're talking about 1,796 stabbings since the beginning of the year. So if you look at both of them in a half a year's time, and we're just approaching summer right now, you're looking at 3,419 stabbings. If you times that by 2 to make it 2 years, you're talking about 6,838 stabbings. And under this legislation, more people will be carrying knives out there. So right now, we're trying to cut back on the number of people that are carrying openly knives. So we're lucky if we only hit 6,838 stabbings. All right? I feel bad for the police officer that shows up on a scene where somebody's killed with a knife, and they have to go tell a mother or a father that their child has expired, and that we helped by turning around and making it easier for people to carry weapons out in public. I mean, what's next? Are we going to allow swords where people can strap a sword on their side? We can have duels in the middle of the street and all run around like the Three Musketeers? This is bad legislation. I mean, your intent might be good, but if you look at it, especially now, when you open the paper every single day, and every single day you see a stabbing or a slashing. I know everybody's seen the thing where people are walking up to people and women just walking down the street minding their own business, and they're walking up and slashing people's faces. You want to make this easier? At a time when this body's taking away guns, we're going to arm the criminals. I would suggest everyone vote no on this bill. It's a dangerous bill. You're putting our citizens in jeopardy. And though it's well-intentioned, it's not timely. Thank you.